Disruption, whether geopolitical, economic, or technological, rarely remain confined. They ripple across borders, affecting production, trade, and ultimately domestic stability. This session will focus on understanding how such disruptions in global supply chain are shaping India's economic and strategic responses. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel for this session. Mr. Deekhit Bhattacharya is a Delhi-based lawyer currently working as an associate at Luthra and Luthra Law Offices, India. He has co-authored a book on the subject of today's discussion, along with Professor Desraju, bringing an analytical lens to contemporary global challenges. He specializes in corporate affairs, technology, capital markets, and international trade, and has authored several research-driven works at the intersection of policy, economics, and emerging technologies. The next speaker for the session is Mr. Ambuj Sahu. He's an assistant professor at Rishihood University and a PhD candidate in political science at Indiana University, Bloomington. His research focuses on international security, crisis bargaining, and India's relation in the Indo-Pacific. His work integrates quantitative methods including GIS and network analysis, and he has co-founded the Bridge Project, a platform on academia policy dialogue. The third speaker for the session is Mr. Kamal Madishetty, is assistant professor at Rishihood University, specializing in international relations and technology policy, and also a visiting fellow at India Foundation. He is an alumnus of IIT Guwahati and OP Jindal Global University and has worked with institutions including the Economist Intelligence Unit and Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, IDSA. We are once again privileged to have with us Mr. Safi Ahsan Rizvi moderating this session as well. I would now request the panelists and the speakers to kindly come on the dais. So I would now request the moderator to kindly present a token to welcome the speakers. So that's why I did not say mementos. I said a token to welcome them. I would now request the moderator to proceed with the discussion. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you for the audience and the panelists. So we have two professorial people and we have one young lawyer, and the young lawyer has gone and written a book also. So I haven't even written my first book and I'm 60 years old, and I do plan to write 12 books, but only the topic is decided and what will go into them is not decided yet. So I'm sure I'll come to you for some help. And we have two professors. You're both associated with Rishihood University and you're in your own fields of work. So we will come to you one by one. So I think it would be only good to start with the youngest person on the panel, and who's written a book, and he's a lawyer. So can you tell us all about this very interesting book that you've written on, and I'm sure you started writing it much before the Iran war. So you seem to be a clairvoyant person. So can you tell us about the book and what prompted you to write a book on this subject?
Thank you for having me, sir, firstly. Um, so this book is actually an outcome of one of the greatest disruptions, economic and political, that humankind has seen, which was COVID. During the COVID era, project was being run concerning many of the disruptions in our supply chains that had simply not been mapped or anticipated. So we all, some of us might have heard of the concept of black swans. So black swans are events which cannot be predicted, are generally of a very high intensity, and the kind of disruptions they cause require on-the-spot thinking. You cannot really understand how these black swans work. And I had stuck my neck out at that point and I'd said, it's not a black swan. COVID was not a black swan, it was a gray rhino. That is a lesser known term. A gray rhino is an event or a disruption with a very high probability of occurring at some point. At what point, no one knows. And with a very high understanding, at least of the first 2 degrees of its impact. So many national epidemiological organizations, whether it's America or even India, had in fact done a fair bit of mapping as to whether such such a catastrophe as COVID, when it occurs, how would it basically go forward? But no one had really done the economic mapping. So what we were usually concerned with was physical military conflict, or most popularly in India, we've been doing this since at least the 60s. If there's a crisis in the Gulf and oil runs out, what do we do? But what we had not anticipated as a country largely was when a gray rhino like this occurs in an interconnected world. And by interconnected, I mean not a complicated world. So just to clarify, let's say there's a clock on the wall there. It has got many gears running. It has got springs running. If any one gear or spring stops working, the clock stops. That's a complicated system. But the world we live in, at least at the very macro level, is a complex system. What's the difference? A complex system constantly adapts. It constantly changes, morphs, responds. So our economic relations and our political relations, and I will come to the relationship between the two and how it's changed. They're a complex system, not a complicated one. And once we understand the reality of it being a complex system, it became apparent to us that many of our supply chain vulnerabilities are directly connected to 2 things. Firstly, of course, the immediate economic impact that might occur. But secondly, and more importantly, are our long-term geopolitical and political priorities as well. And this book is not an economics book. This book is fundamentally a book that tries to explain the relationship between geopolitics, economics, and strategy for a country, and then takes 7 case studies across 7 different sectors in India. So we've taken agriculture, we've taken semiconductors, we've taken AI, space, we've taken rare earths. And then we try to use our framework on these 7 sectors to illustrate as well as to understand that how can India, A, achieve the geopolitical ambitions it intends to achieve, and what will it take economically and politically to do that? And hence the term war. See, a war today doesn't necessarily involve armies fighting or missiles flying. The moment we understand that all economic relations can be weaponized, something which we are no strangers to, China and US do it all the time these days. The moment we understand that any economic relationship can be weaponized and any political relationship can be leveraged economically, all of politics and all of economics, at least in the world we currently live in, is war, and we're going through war. So this book is just a small insight into how that works.
So, would you have offered any solutions towards the end on how to bring about peace?
Unfortunately, what happens is we've used this term Matsya Nyaya, which I'm sure both professors would be well aware of. The broad canvas on which this book is just a speck is the decline of American hard power and how the world as a complex system is adapting to it, including America itself. So America's burial of the rules-based order is not an accident or an aberrant reaction by an extremist president. It's very convenient for us to state it that way. But the fact of the matter is, since the Biden presidency itself, and actually since the Obama presidency itself, the burial that was being given to the rules-based order was America's response to its limited relative capabilities when it came to hard power and securing global sea lanes of communication. So when it comes to suggestions on bringing peace, unfortunately, the world we live in, peace can only be achieved through strength. So I believe that we'll have to take a cue from President Kalam, and that strength through peace is peace through strength is the only way. Now, what that strength entails is not brute aggression. It is for us to understand the supply chains where we are weak, and then realistically understand and realistically evaluate, can there be places where we can make the supply chain stronger or more resilient for us, and A, insulate ourselves from shocks that might come, and B, have a deterrent capability with regards to others by telling them, hey, if you do something funny, there might be a shock coming your way. So just a small example and a very recent example. Just some time ago, as a matter of fact, end of last year and beginning of this year, almost every single automotive organization in India, regardless of scale, was joining Indian diplomatic missions and flying non-stop to Beijing and Shanghai. Why? Permanent rare earth magnet exports to India had stopped. You cannot build modern cars without these things, at least the kind of cars you and me would drive. And when it comes to the automotive sector, it's the largest export-oriented employer in India. It is one of the most comprehensive supply chains in India, on which large sections of the economy depend directly as well as indirectly. So this one small magnet became a national crisis for around 45 days. And India was forced to tell the Chinese that fine, we will make sure that there will be no re-exports to America for military use of these magnets.
So what option do we have to magnets?
Now that is incidentally one of the chapters. And some of our recommendations, so the recommendations in this book are actually not narrative driven or even written in a narrative style. We've given 1, 3, and 5 year solid pointed recommendations as to this is our situation. This is the scope of immediate improvement, medium term improvement, long term improvement, considering our economic and political capabilities, assuming so and so. So when it comes to magnets, for example, right after that happened, there was a slew of announcements that were made, some of which were understated and some of which were not. One of those announcements was that India will start operations on a samarium cobalt magnet facility. Now, samarium cobalt does not depend largely to neodymium and dysprosium, two supply chains which China has an absolute brutish strength over. So samarium and cobalt might not be the perfect solution for cars. It is mostly used for smaller things. But we realize that there's a price to be paid for everything, including resilience. It's sort of like an insurance policy. This is where we have to start, so might as well start with it. And likewise, ultimately, this book is about evaluating stating the options you've got, evaluating the time period and money you can spend, and then giving recommendations as to how we can pick the correct option for ourselves.
Excellent, excellent. So that's very well explained, and especially where you started, which was started with the bio disaster. So we'll go to Professor Kamal first, and he made mention. The young author made mention of samarium cobalt, which is one of the big things that maybe you work on. You work on critical minerals and rare earths. So critical minerals and rare earths are used in like one breath, you know. It's like saying pandemic aa gaya. So just try and break it down for us that, I mean, please don't go into that periodic table, but just break it down for people who are non-chemistry students as to the difference between critical minerals and rare earths and the general situation over the world about these supply chains.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. And congratulations to Deekhit. It's an excellent book. I've had the pleasure to read it and not just read it, but also incorporate it into our syllabus at Rishihood University. So in fact, we run a course called Technology and Policy. That's what both of us are associated with, and we run this course. And as part of the curriculum, I think it's been a delight to actually have a book like this, which is in many ways at the cutting edge of the conversation. Typically in university curriculums, I studied at an IIT, and even in an IIT, the curriculums are updated once every few years. And the world today changes every few weeks, if not days, right? So I think that kind of highlights the necessity of being on top of the theme. And I think this book, I think, is an excellent contribution, I think, because it goes through very practical, like I think Deekhit rightly mentioned towards the end, that the recommendations are also very, actionable in a sense, not very abstract, not very generic. So I think that was, I really enjoyed reading it. Although I think the framing of empires, I think, is something that I would love to discuss at some point. But coming to you, coming to the questions, I think critical minerals has become increasingly at the core of what people have called geopolitics of technology. And that's something that we've been looking at as well very closely. And geopolitics of technology includes, competition over semiconductor devices. It includes the competition over critical minerals, which of course includes rare earth elements, as well as, of course, artificial intelligence and various other fields, frontier fields, quantum computing, and so on. So as far as critical minerals are concerned, I think a lot of times the terminologies, like you rightly said, are slightly muddled. And I think it's because perhaps the words have some meaning which we attach from our everyday experience of those words. So when we say critical minerals or rare earth elements for that matter, a lot of them are actually not that rare, right? But what is I think important is that what is their use, how much are we able to mine them, how much are we able to process them. I think these are the more limiting questions, or the questions that impose limitations on countries. If I have to break it down, there's mining, there's processing, and then there are reserves. Mining itself is, of course, spread across different geographies in the world, but there's a lot of concentration there. For instance, Indonesia has a lot of nickel reserves. The Democratic Republic of Congo has a lot of cobalt reserves. I mean, the percentages keep shifting, but I think nickel about 40% is in Indonesia, about I think 60%. I think Deekhit would probably correct me on that. But cobalt comes from Congo. Now that is the mining. Now the other and the more serious risk of overconcentration is with respect to processing. Now, you can have the reserves and you can mine all you want, but if you do not have the technology to process that, you cannot take it forward in the value chain. And there, the dominance of China is something that is extraordinary, because when it comes to, I think most of the materials, I mean, the percentages vary from anywhere between 60% to sometimes even 100% in some of the critical minerals. And China has developed tremendous amount of manufacturing capabilities, processing capabilities when it comes to critical minerals, which gives it an outsized amount of pricing power. It puts, in many ways, to put it simply, many countries in the world at the mercy of Chinese policy. There have been risks of course, over concentration. There have been risks of resource nationalism across different parts of the world. Again, there have been examples of even other countries when it comes to that. Chile, Indonesia have also imposed some kind of restrictions, and China, of course. And there are risks of choke points, because if you look at the supply chain, and we've been talking about supply chains, and if you look at supply chains of critical minerals, it starts with the reserves. It progresses into mining and then processing, and then the other stages after that. But any point along this supply chain can go wrong, and that can lead to a supply chain related problems in this particular domain. So I think the key sort of risk has been of China, and different countries have responded to it differently. India, of course, has its own strategy. Happy to talk about that, but I think that's the global, at least, picture as of now that stands for the critical minerals.
Okay, so one question I'll come back to you with after we deal with Professor Ambuj is that China didn't start yesterday.
Yes.
They started
Yes.
30 years
Yeah.
ago. So please expound on that as to what was the rest of the world doing when China decided and wrote that first paper that we need to start focusing on this thing. Nobody had heard about magnets and nothing
Yeah.
about the kind. So why did they focus on cobalt? Why did they focus on nickel? So we'll come to
Yeah.
you after that.
Yeah.
So we'll first go to Professor Ambuj. Could you just tell us a little about what you teach and what are your specialities?
Uh, Hi, thank you for inviting me to the panel. So I currently teach technology and policy along with Kamal,
and I'm trained as an electrical engineer at IIT Delhi, after which I transitioned into studying international relations, and currently I'm writing a dissertation on India-China relations, especially how crisis decision making takes place at the border. In addition to that, I also like working on technology, supply chains, and the international politics around it. So, yeah.
One of the key questions that arises when you speak of the India-China relationship is that one of the most bandied about terms is that we should be self-reliant, Atmanirbhar, and that is something we've been hearing for several decades in this country. And now also there's a lot of focus, a lot of government policies are focused on Atmanirbharta. So there must be some limits to it. Like, I mean, why did these global chains start? Because the entire environment allowed it, and the environment needed it. There was demand, there was supply, and there were people willing to allow it to pass through. Now suddenly everything seems to be breaking down, and every single supply chain, which is so complex as he was mentioning, it seems to be breaking down. So can we just become resilient on everything, especially with regard to the important things?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So before you talked pertinently about a point that there were some reasons due to which the existing system come into place, and to understand that we have to go into classical economics a bit. That we must have studied in our economics classes that there are four factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Now, when we apply this idea of production on international economies, then also like along with the idea of comparative advantage, that if my country has a good labor, I'll rather contribute labor to their product, and if one country has a lot of capital, they can contribute a lot of capital in the product, and in doing this, we will ensure that the total amount of products or commodities that we produce in the world will be maximized. That is something which is called as Pareto frontier. Now, what happens that after World War II, when capitalism became the ideology, so there has been a historical trend that the global hegemon has a tendency to export their domestic economic system into the world. For example, the British, when they were ruling the seas during the Industrial Revolution, they exported the system of mercantilism. Similarly, Americans exported capitalism. And when that happened, this current mode of production took place because labor was apparently cheap in East Asia, so production supply chains shifted from the West to East Asia. Right, raw materials were abundant in Africa and Southeast Asia, so these sites became the hub of critical minerals mining, or like jute and rubber and different commodities. Now, what goes wrong with this classical economic framework is that the question of strategies and security are not accounted for. Now, it is a fun fact that I'd like to share that out of like 700 page thick book, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, on which the modern capitalism is based on, in book 6, he explicitly writes that defense is more important than opulence. So my model fails once national security is in the line, and that is something perhaps people do not talk about often. So now what is happening in the current world is we are in that defense is more important in opulence era, where the idea is not to maximize the production as a world, but securing the supplies as a state. And that's where the idea of self-reliance comes in. Now, obviously there are limits to self-reliance because we cannot produce everything at our own, because the amount of resources that we'll require will be tremendous. For instance, if we take the case of semiconductors, right? So an average chip, when it starts from a grain of silica in the sand, right, to reaching my phone, crosses international borders around 70 times. Now, there is an estimate, I guess BCG came out with a report in 2021 when semiconductors were becoming like kind of like the buzzword, that it would take an additional investment of $1 trillion globally so that countries can make their semiconductors end to end with the country, which is a humongous amount of investment. So those are the limits of self-reliance. Self-reliance.
So just one second. So what you're basically, your response to, can self-reliance be complete? You're saying that's limited to
That's
quite an extent.
yeah.
For every supply chain is different. So, but only those things that you can do, you should try to do, as he mentioned in his opening remarks. So, when you are going to have self-reliance in a slightly limited way, then at the end of the day, to continue your supply chain, supply and outside and export and import, you still need very good foreign relations.
Yes.
and you'd still need some globalization agency. You need peace rather than war. So where do we go in this discussion?
So
It cannot be a zero and
yes,
one discussion.
yes. So before foreign relations, I think strategic priorities of a country also becomes really important. For example, if India is a country of 1.4 billion people, and then and if I'm asked to choose the sectors where we should prioritize, because the very definition of strategy is to be able to generate power with limited means, with all the unlimited desires we have. So as they said that amdani athanni kharcha rupaya. So every nation has a kharcha rupaya, but amdani is always athanni. So we have to meet that gap, and that gap, the art of meeting that gap is strategy. So to overcome the limits of self-reliance, I'll recommend three options. One is to prioritize. For example, I think for India, the ultimate prioritization comes towards its people and the phase of economic development that we are in. When it comes to people, people need food on their plate. To make the food on their plate, they need to have food security that comes from fertilizers, and recently they should also have the cooking gas that is needed to cook. Right. So, for example, in the Rishihood University campus, our samosas and all the pakoras were replaced by these baked bakery wale biscuit and butter because the LPG supply was not coming. So and bulk drug is one more thing. Now we move to the second step, that if our economy is growing, we need more consumption based on white goods, AC, fridges, refrigerators. Then we might need semiconductors of like 120 to 180 nanometer chips that power these devices. We do not need perhaps a 2 nanometer chip to make a super trendy generative AI. So we have to prioritize. That's the first part. The second part comes on the foreign relations part of it, that we have to diversify, that we cannot be dependent on any one country for a particular commodity. So the most prioritized, we try to produce everything by ourselves. The second stage comes in, we rely on diversification, and that's how we go ahead.
Okay, great, great. So we'll come to you with the question that was leaked to you a little while ago.
Right. So no, I think in many ways China was investing in the physical world when the rest of the world, but particularly the West, was focusing on the software industry, the dot-com sort of boom, and later bubble. So I think China has benefited from that focus in the last not few years but decades, almost 2 or 3 decades, that China has invested in these physical capabilities, manufacturing capabilities, processing capabilities, and I think it has also been able to do that because it has leveraged and exploited its somewhat lax environmental regulations, because China does not has the burden of having environmental and social regulations in a way that many other countries have. So the environmental cost has been tremendous. Often not even accounted for, not even documented. So there is that element of the story as well. In fact, for example, the mining activities of China in Tibet, for instance, have caused a lot of environmental degradation in that region. There's an example of Lichu River, if I remember correctly, which about, I think, 10 years ago had a very serious sort of a case of poisoning of the entire river, which affected the local ecosystems over there. Now, the fact is that this is, of course, not just environmental impact. This also has strategic implications, particularly for a country like India, because Tibet is it's the roof of the world. It is source to a number of river ecosystems in the entire region, including the Brahmaputra, but many other rivers as well into Southeast Asia. And environmental degradation there has implications for us and many other countries as well. Besides, of course, the military presence that comes along with industrial presence, which again raises sort of strategic questions for a country like India. So I think if you look at least from an Indian perspective, and there's no doubt that I think I totally sort of agree that there are limits to self-reliance when it comes to strategic, supply chain resilience. And I think that's where the identification, of course, of priorities, but also strategic sectors is important. So that's something that reminds me of the book itself, because I think you've put down like six or seven strategic sectors, including fertilizers, including energy, critical minerals, semiconductors, right? So all of these strategic sectors are indeed very strategic, and therefore deserve a lot of focus. Yes.
So if you look at it today,
Yeah.
so today we, despite whatever may be going on in the newspapers about the US and India, at the end of the day, we continue to freely import and export whatever we are doing with an occasional tariff here and there. And the same thing with China. The entry and the outflow of goods and services is going on smoothly. So when we are in a good place from the point of view of the US and China with regard to actual trade, is there something really major to worry about?
Well, I think, well, yes, India has a strategy, but I think, yes, there still are risks. And I say that because, I mean, if you look at India's strategy, like if I can just take a couple of minutes to just lay it out, we have a two-pronged strategy. We have one is domestic focused and the other is external focused. On the domestic side, we've been amending our legislations around mining. We're making it easier for private companies to take up mining activities. A lot of outdated laws have been amended. A lot of auctioning mechanisms have been put in place for smoother, faster, sort of activity, economic activity around mining. We also have made it easier for center state to coordinate on some of these things. We've come up with some institutional mechanisms to protect for environmental safeguards, like there is a district mineral foundation, the DMF, which has now been instituted, and things like that. At the same time, there's a parallel strategy which is looking outwards, because there's no way, like has been rightly identified, that you will have everything being manufactured here or everything mined here. I mean, in fact, reserves are not entirely here. So how? But at the same time, you need to have good foreign relations, like you said. And for that, I think there's been, again, there is the Kabil, the Khanij Bidesh Limited, which essentially is like a team or a group which is going out, scouring the world, which is looking out in the world for reserves, for processing capabilities, acquiring stakes in that. We've been acquiring, equity stakes in, mining and processing activities in Argentina, for example, recently last year. So Kabil is tasked with this. At the same time, there are lots of multilateral, plurilateral groupings around critical minerals, like, of course, most recently Pax Silica, but many others before that as well. Quad has a focus on critical minerals. We have bilateral arrangements, especially with countries like Australia. So as part of the trade agreement with Australia, the tariffs on critical minerals have been reduced to zero. And that has helped incentivize Australian companies, which were earlier just looking at China for processing sort of activities, to now also invest in India, to consider investing in India because of the complete removal of tariffs. And that's where I think a lot of these trade agreements that India has been continuously signing in the last 2 or 3 years, I think become very important. Yeah, I mean, I think therefore it's a mix of foreign sort of partnerships along with building up domestic capabilities simultaneously. I think that's been India's strategy going so far.
Interesting. So interesting that you brought up the concept of the PSU Kabil. So uh, one thing about Kabil is that it's again in the public sector. The government of India is doing it. Whereas the larger amount of resources lie in the private sector, the global private sector, multinational sector, and you need a lot of money to buy stakes. And I mean, not stakes, but stakes in companies, equity stake in companies. And where will that money come from? So, why should the government exchequer take the responsibility upon itself? Why can't Kabil get together with, say, 10 Indian banks that are large or 10 Indian corporations that are large, build a conglomerate, and then go out and look for these kind of opportunities? Because things are best done when it follows a business model rather than a public sector acquisition model. How would you react to that?
So before I answer that question, which the book has dedicated a significant amount of ink to, some additional context is necessary to what I believe are actual trade numbers when it comes to USA, China, and India. So if I ask a very simple question, we'll introduce a little bit of data to the conversation. If I ask a very simple question, why is it that since 2021, the Indian textile exports have not taken off? So many of the earlier responses which would have held true at some point, logistics cost, low scale, lack of investment, lack of technology. When we actually analyze at a micro level that are our industries as competitive or not as Bangladesh or Vietnam, the answer is actually we have a slight competitive advantage. But what has happened is, when President Trump's first term started, our recognition as a developing country was taken away by the US, and that had a tariff implication. It was very well designed. And why do I say very well designed? Because they've done this multiple times before. Our fluorochemical industry, which is centered mostly around Dahej and Gujarat, was similarly very pointedly targeted by American authorities when they could see that we were scaling up. And they've set back our fluorochemical ambitions by at least 5 to 7 years. They destroyed a company that had very unique IP and technology to do something very particular in the sector. Similarly, China has also weaponized its trade relations with us, and I've already given an example of rare earth magnets, but they've done this in pharma, in chemicals, and most recently in agrochemicals. They knew that it's going to bite when the monsoons are probably going to be poor, and the season for the monsoons is slightly far away, so planning has to be done. So even agrochemical precursor exports faced an unprecedented and unexplained restriction from China when it came to India. So actual trade is not normal between normal in the sense of what I would probably call post World War II, pre 2008 consensus. That was a time when, because of the brute force of American hard power and the architecture that came with it, the economic architecture that came with it, we generally lived in a deflationary world. We generally lived in a world where you could afford efficiency over resilience. And now, if I come back to the question, and this is where your question fits in perfectly, the principal problem which any particular state faces is that its priorities, strategic priorities as a state, might not align fully with the profit driven incentives of the industry. The art of building lasting conglomerates, which is what Japan and South Korea and to some degree Taiwan have done, is to align them to the maximum possible extent and design an incentive architecture where the two essentially complement each other. So for example, if I ask a very simple question, how is it that Taiwan Semiconductors does what it does? Why does it have such a big monopoly? Or if I ask, why is Samsung the second largest producer of phones? The answer actually goes back to the government investing in a lot of basic infrastructure, as well as building an incentive infrastructure for the chaebols to come up in South Korea, or the semiconductor groupings to come up in Japan when it used to lead. So I'll just give a very brief example. There is a problem when it comes to multiple companies in semiconductors because each specializes in some very, very particular domain that has no value unless it's combined with another domain. But this one company does not want to share its IP with the other. Why? Because what if they enter my turf and eat into my profits? At that point, Japan forcefully told its banks that you will not lend to these corporations until they pool their IP. So the state has to use both carrot and stick when you live in a securitized environment. And when it comes to minerals,
So are you saying that the Indian state is not using the stick?
unfortunately, what I believe it is that it's not that it's not using the stick. It has to be used very wisely. And that comes with a lot of experience that's unique to the context. What China did, Japan cannot do. What Japan did, South Korea cannot do. What South Korea did, Taiwan cannot do. And what we will do, none of them can do, and vice versa.
So in the example of Kabil, would it be wise to bring in the corporate sector into its work?
A very frank answer would be, okay, let us evaluate it. Let us evaluate it from a fresh eye. Do India's mining giants have the kind of technology necessary, technological thoroughfare necessary to engage themselves in rare earth extraction where possibly the ore quality might be low, because most of the higher ore qualities are in highly concentrated places which are already highly militarized. So if I take a look at just DRC, where cobalt comes from, there's private military contractors of at least 7 different countries operating there. So you will have to work with low ore quality. And secondly, do they have the ability to transform that ore at least into something that can be processed further? As in, the jump from ore to metal has multiple stages.
Okay.
The answer is they don't currently,
So case by case,
case
supply
by
chain
case.
by supply chain. So we'll come to you here, and we generally tend to discuss things much more when there's a crisis at hand. When there is COVID, then we tend to discuss ki, Arey, why is there COVID and why should we not be doing more for public health, and so many more hospitals should be made. Same story when the Iran war is happening. So there was a mini Iran war that happened for 12 days in middle of 2025. Then nobody spoke of the blockage of the Hormuz Strait. So to some extent, China has demonstrated that they are not reactive, they are proactive. When they started writing their Chinese defense white papers in the year 2000, they spoke of a blue water navy at that time when they didn't have a single aircraft carrier. They didn't have any bases where they could keep their nuclear powered submarines. But then slowly they built themselves to that state. So we don't seem to be very proactive in these matters. Do you see it that way, or there is a correction somewhere?
So I think that our policy responses to anything, be it supply chains or foreign policy or even like domestic politics, it's very reactive. And as a young scholar, I'm still trying to find an answer. Why do we need a crisis to come up? But like, let's first talk about China that you talked about. They were talking about blue water navy in 2000s, and now they have it. Similarly, when Made in China 2025 program came in 2015, they had this target that in 10 years will dominate around like 2/3 of the EV market in the world, and today they do it. They are doing it. So what is it about China that helps them forecast, or like obviously they cannot know the future, but there has to be something that goes into their cultural institutional memory. And I can find like basic explanations of why the Chinese are able to look ahead in the advance. So we have to go back in the history. So there are like two concepts related to China that helps explain their cultural mindset, especially towards technology, supply chain, and innovation. One is this idea of century of humiliation, where they were around between opium wars in 1850s till like liberation by the Communist Party in 1949. There was this period of 100 years where China was humiliated again and again by Western powers through military defeats, through economic repercussions, and and one of the major reasons that the Chinese, the forefathers of the People's Republic, thought that we were lagging behind in technology and did not adapt the latest of education and trends that are going around in the world. Now, that's the first strand. The second strand comes from the Marxist ideology of how Marxism looks towards technology. And like incidentally, today is Karl Marx's birthday. Yeah. So there's this idea of historical materialism where basically the material forces determine the course of politics and whatever goes on. So there's a base, which is the economic forces making the base, and everything about that, maybe institutions or politics or foreign relations, anything that's superstructure. So that basically what happened in 1978, that when Deng Xiaoping came to the power, he said that technology is also a factor of production that shapes economic forces. So that's why ideologically the Chinese state became very committed to technology and innovation.
So they added a fifth point.
They added one more point. But during Mao Zedong, there was this idea that people who are doing technology, the academics, they are the bourgeois classes, so they need to be persecuted. So the moment the first science and tech, a fun fact, science and technology. Deng Xiaoping, when he was serving as vice premier to Mao in 1950s before getting purged, he was focusing on education and science and technology. And due to his ideas, he was like sidetracked that, oh, you're too capitalist for my taste. So when you see these two strands in the Chinese state over the last 50 years, they have this obsession for technology, because whenever they lose the technology, they think that they will lose this economic mode of production. They will they will have that century of humiliation time back. Now,
That I must tell you, since 4 p.m., this is the best point made today.
oh,
So we must clap for him. That's normally a not known fact that why are the Chinese so obsessed with technology? That's a brilliant point you
yeah,
made.
and that's why when you go to Shenzhen, it will look like we are living in a different world rather than. So now coming back to India, the question that I asked, and I still do not have an answer, that who are we? What is our cultural mindset then? And there was this book recently released by Dan Wong called Breakneck, where he argues that Americans have the mindset of a lawyer, and the Chinese have the mindset of an engineer, right? And like, I've been in US for 4 years, and I can vouch for it. That's very loyally regulations, rules, and every for the little for the minutest of thing. So perhaps what we have to do is to identify what is our cultural mindset, and I think, I mean, so far our my answer, and it is subjected to change as I learn more and progress more in my professional journey, that we are a very crisis-driven people. Even engineering students like to study only one night before the exam; they'll waste the entire semester, right? People like to work जब पीछे से डंडा पड़ेगा किसी को. So if that is our mindset, that is also being reflected in the nation, that we are not opening our mindset, opening our economy for 30 years, and then suddenly 1991 happens, Gulf War happens, we don't have, there's a balance of crisis, the economy is open. We do not have enough resources to make PP, but then COVID happened, and then we scaled up and we vaccinated like anything. So we have this ability to deliver at scale, but then we have to ask that why do we need a crisis to deliver? So I mean, I don't have an answer to the question, but I have some.
We're a noisy democracy. Possibly that's
Yeah.
the reason. Yeah.
No, I mean, incidentally, the science, technology, and innovation policy in India came about in the year 2020, just after the pandemic. And in many ways, that has actually, it's done a lot of good, it's made a lot of important contributions to our innovation ecosystem, science and technology. But it totally sort of confirms what Ambuj has just said, that there's a tendency to be very reactive. Even something as important as the science, technology, and innovation policy came about right after the pandemic, and it came about because the pandemic exposed deficiencies and weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our science and technology ecosystem. And of course, Ambuj spoke about China, but if we look around, and this is something that we have discussed at Rishihood, which is we're looking at the different innovation models that different countries have, right? China, of course, Ambuj has very rightly covered, but look at the US, for example, right? It has a certain ecosystem, certain model of innovation, which is laissez-faire capitalism, which is venture capitalist driven, and so on. The South Korea, like Deekhit mentioned, has the chaebol model, right? Which is a huge businesses. I think about 70% of the market share in the South Korean, equivalent of Sensex. 70% is just held by 4 companies, right? Yeah, 50% of GDP. Yeah, the capex of the market. So South Korea has a certain model, right, which is, and again, it has certain limitations, it has certain drawbacks also, it has led to some kind of inequalities and so on. Israel has its own model, because when we talk about startups and innovation, they have a certain model which is very national security driven and so on. What we see in India, of course, I think are elements of all of these. We do see a venture capitalist driven model. If you go to Bengaluru, that's what there is, right? A lot of my friends from IITs are very much engaged in that ecosystem. We do have China style missions, state led missions, the semiconductor mission, the quantum mission, and so on. But I think one good thing, in my view, that has happened in more recent times is that the missions are no longer happening in isolation. So I think that's the one big change in India, is that earlier the missions were isolated from market dynamics. today I think the missions that the government of India is running are right in the middle of the market. They are talking about how do we integrate and have better interaction with the market. We have private sector participation that's being encouraged even in space, right? There are reforms in the space sector in India, Antriksh and other entities which have been created. So I think that's been a welcome change in my view, that we do have missions, and I think missions are important, state-led missions are important, but they're not insulated from market dynamics anymore. And at the same time, we also see elements of a national security-driven innovation system. IDEX is one example that we have. I think recently the South Korean president was here, and we have launched a IDEX equivalent between South Korea and India, right? So I think so the getting the innovation model right, I think, is the direct sort of implication of what Ambuj said, which is in terms of identifying what our societal, our industrial, and political strengths are, political in the political system sense, and arriving at an innovation model that harmonizes all of these strengths. I don't know how the entire picture would look like, but I think one part of it definitely is innovating at scale. I think that's been one feature of the Indian innovation ecosystem, which I think has prominently emerged, and I think it has well established itself now. You look at India's G20 presidency, you look at any of India's global technological initiatives. This is a common feature that you could see across all of what India has been projecting. So I don't know about the full picture, but this is definitely one part of
So
it.
the picture that you've given us qualifies you for the Indian Foreign Service. I congratulate you on that. And that was a very good summary of all the things done in the last 5, 7 years. So I am going back to Kabin.
So just a second. I think there's an additional layer of analysis that
Another applicant for the Foreign Service.
if you take a look at what's been happening across all of the models, and especially the Chinese historical experience with innovation. For example, in the US, you will be surprised that their rare earths initiative, which hinges mostly around Mountain Pass. So Mountain Pass is actually the only place on the planet where you will find all of the rare earths in one place. And before China was big, all of the world's rare earths used to come from Mountain Pass in the US. So Mountain Pass project, its revival, is being done by the Department of Defense. Similarly, in China, if I take a look at two particular sectors, semiconductors and solar. In semiconductors today, as we speak, there is a massive consolidation going on. And by consolidation, I mean bankruptcies. But that's not bankruptcies as we would understand it, ki diwala nikal gaya. These are controlled bankruptcies where they are actively trying to weed out firms which are not economically sustainable. So they're telling each other to merge. They're saying that if you can't carry on business through market dynamics, get lost. And this is after years and years of the Chinese state burning cash to get them afloat. So what we can understand both through the American as well as the Chinese experience of late is that these models are actually unique to A, which supply chain you're on, how securitized it is, and B, what stage of the supply chain you're on with regards to how well established you are in terms of the complexity. What stage, what node are you at? So till now, the idea that we need a model to move through things. Perhaps we need a model of models to understand that if there is good X, which has components so and so, and I am on supply chain this, based on factors such as securitization, based on factors such as my foreign relations, and based on factors, do I have the necessary domestic talent and the ability to retain them? The model will emerge based on the supply chain.
So we've got these points that have been made just now. I'll take you to this supply. This question is to you. Supply resiliency initiative that JP Morgan has started. So they've put $10 billion for it of their own money, and which basically means they'll do private equity deals in which they'll put their own money. They won't raise it from somewhere else. And it's a total $1.5 trillion initiative, and they are focusing primarily on the sensitive sectors, which is basically the nest sectors, and of which critical chains is one. There are some 27 sectors in that. Now, the reason why I was saying that the Kabin model, which is purely public sector led, and basically our taxes led. And this model of JP Morgan, which is a private sector led initiative, possibly supported by the state, and they are talking of $1.15 trillion. So they are talking of bringing in Australia, South Korea, Japan, in Asia, and various other such countries, which are it's already planned out by a private company. So private sector, if they do these things through profit motive, they will be able to discover a lot of the positives that come out of the book of Wealth of Nations, and they'll be able to get to the sweet spot much faster than if just the government does it. So how would you react to that?
No, I think it definitely has to be a combination of government-led initiatives as well as private participation. I think, like Deekhit said, I think depending on the sector and depending on the maturity of private sector capabilities in that particular sector, I think the government can make way, make space, and actively facilitate private sector activity in those sectors. Um, I think that's where the Indian model is different from, let's say, the Chinese model or the American model, which have been, in a sense, like roughly speaking, two opposite or two separate approaches. Because I think in India, the idea is not to have a statist or a protectionist kind of an approach of pre 1991. I think the approach is to for the state to create a certain minimum common infrastructure which can then be the foundation for private sector innovation to happen. The best, of course, example of that is DPI, the digital public infrastructure, right? And all of the various instruments of or various aspects of digital public infrastructure. And we've built, the payments sort of layer, for instance, right? UPI provides a certain basic common digital infrastructure, public infrastructure, which has unlocked a lot of potential of the private sector, right? The kind of interoperability that we see, the kind of widespread private participation that we see on top of this particular layer, I think is something that we've seen. Now, of course, there are sectors in which DPI can expand even further, like e-commerce, for example. I mean, I think it's still early stages. Unfortunately, I think there's been a lot of effort that has been put into, initiatives like ONDC, for example, right? So ONDC is trying to do what UPI did to payments, in a sense, right? ONDC is trying to create that digital public infrastructure for e-commerce to happen in a manner that unlocks private innovation, but at the same time has a certain public interest in mind. And I think that's been the common feature. So, and that's what I also mean when I say innovation at scale or innovation at a population scale, in a sense, is innovation very much can happen through the private sector. But I think given the, like what Deekhit said, if we want to align our roughly speaking, strategic national interests with the economic profitability of the private sector, I think it is best served when some of these innovations happen at population scale, because that serves the Indian interests and the pressing needs of this moment much better than innovation for the sake of innovation or innovation in the other ways that we've seen
Okay,
globally.
right, thanks. So I think we have about 15 minutes left. We can take some questions. Yes, please. Yeah, mic एक कर दीजिएगा.
What's the role of cluster building? Because competitiveness is highly dependent these days on cluster building and the role of proximity in controlling cost and speeding the process. So tell us something about it.
Who is it directed to, sir? The question?
I think any of you who can find it convenient.
No, I mean, please feel free to chip in. So I think clusters definitely are important. I mean, just from a pure economic perspective, clusters bring a certain advantage. They bring advantages of scale, of many other expertise, of many other things. I think there's no doubt about the importance of clusters, and therefore I think we've seen some focused sort of activity around certain clusters. I come from Hyderabad originally, so we've had like pharma, biotech clusters that are being created over there, aerospace related clusters that are being created around there. But at the same time, I think, having said that, I think one piece of our attention should also be towards the fact that I think because of AI and because of the rapid disruption in communication and other technologies and information flow, I mean the kind of technologies of information flow, I think some of the limitations of not having a cluster also can be overcome because of technological progress that we've made on many fronts. So I think while clusters have to be focused upon, I think at the same time there are opportunities for people not physically proximate to clusters who can still be part of that innovation ecosystem, I think. Yeah. Depending on
Correct.
industry.
I'll just quickly illustrate Kamal's point. So if I take a look at Tejas, so Tejas, I don't look at it as an aircraft. I look at it as as basically an ecosystem building process that took around 23 years, and that has around 7,000 different suppliers who specialize in different particular strands of the aircraft. Now, if I geographically map Tejas's suppliers, there are some sitting all the way here in Noida and not Bangalore. There are some that are outside the country. There are some that are deep in Chennai. And you will even find a couple in the Northeast. Now, what we have to understand are three different things. Traditionally, the emergence of clusters emerged firstly because of the time and money cost of logistics, which has drastically come down, especially after technology, where the time and money cost of information in India is practically zero. And secondly, what we also need to understand is the slightly more subtle aspect, which is that places where people who have access to capital, to ideas, to industrial capability, their physical proximity even today does matter to a very large degree, which is why Bangalore remains Bangalore and its way of being Bangalore, and Hyderabad remains Hyderabad in a way. So when we speak of clusters, what perhaps India has been slightly lacking in historically is the interconnections between the different factors and components within the cluster. What we've usually focused on is the hard industrial capability in terms of common facilities. That has been the norm in pharma, textiles, to some degree defense quite until recently. But what was missing was in that cluster, what kind of interaction am I having with capital that might be interested? What kind of interaction am I having with the talent that needs to be built to serve that cluster? And these finer interlinkages, which really make the great industrial clusters of the world the great industrial clusters, attention is only being paid now. So if I take a look at the rare earths ecosystem that's coming up, I was very pleasantly surprised to see that and even in agriculture now, I was very pleasantly surprised to see that you've got these lead institutions which have been given a geography, and along with that, we have the capital, the talent building, and the hard industrial capability which we're focused on coming together. So what clusters will ultimately emerge to become 10, 15, 20 years from now is anyone's guess. They might become dynamos of their own, where ultimately we move towards a portfolio of multi-product capabilities which organically emerge. Again, each cluster is a complex system in its own right. And the state, its role is ultimately building that basic infrastructure to smooth out all the kinks so that the interaction can happen in a most frictionless manner as possible.
Great. That's a very, I don't think he expected such a detailed answer. So that was good. Thank you. Any other question? I think you guys were intellectually very, very high. It's a very deep discussion. ये तो हम लोग कहाँ 200 साल पहले आपने पहुंचा दिया हम लोग को. And it's his birthday today, Karl Marx. So can you also explain dialectic materialism while we are at it after we get this question?
Thank you so much for wonderful insights. Uh, I just want to take you back into history. Like you said that, how China developed 100 years of humiliation, that's very right. But I also feel that in the 1990s and the early 2000, there were two things which happened very prominently. The first was a lot of Chinese students going to the US universities and having sort of made an ecosystem there. And secondly, also you can think about the reverse engineering that was done in a lot of at a lot of industries or places, especially defense. So do you think these are also the reasons why the initially the China was able to get a head start? That's the first question. And second, okay, you answer then I'll ask the second.
Yeah, these two were like definitely the reasons. So not only in early 1990s, it started in like mid 1980s. So Deng Xiaoping visited the US in 1979, and then he also visited Japan during that time after getting rid of the Vietnam mess in early 1980s. And then he visited these factories. He visited the Coca-Cola factory. He visited the Japanese automotive plants, and then he decided he traveled in the bullet train. And there's an interview that I want to have something like this in China. So there was this idea of learning from the other countries, and at the same time, there was also this understanding that we need to get the technology transfer at this level of development. So when that happened, so 1980s was this beginning. Now, what happened in 1990s? The rise of Chinese students in the US. That was also after the Tiananmen Square protests, where like China had to walk an extra mile to convince the Americans that we are not the Mao era kind of completely authoritarian state. So there was a lot of increase in the people-to-people cultural contact, and that's where the students went there. And Americans were also under the impression in 1990s and even in early 2000s when China joined WTO that we might be able to convert China into a democracy, and they kept on inviting it. So this phenomenon definitely helped the Chinese to get the technology. But once that happened, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, they have also started to innovate by their own and making these quality products. So for example, I mean, I recall in my childhood, there was like in mid 2000s there was this proverb in Hindi, China ka maal chale to chand tak, nahi to sham tak. So that is a indication of the development trajectory of China, where simply they're trying to have the technology transfer, reverse engineering and copying it. Sometimes they'll fail, sometimes they won't. But now we do not come across these proverbs when we use the Chinese products today. Whether we use Xiaomi or we use these OnePlus phones, or if we use BYD cars, that are equally sophisticated and in some ways even more sophisticated as the Western products. So this is just phase in the development trajectory.
So that anything else we have? Oh, a second one. Okay. Please don't think of a third now. You're the last question.
Uh, you very rightly brought out it's a very question that we need to think and develop on deeply, that why the kind of culture that we have, the innovation culture that we have. But despite that, and you gave a very clear example, like engineering students, I could really correlate with that last night you study, everybody does that. But despite that, we still have the best technical brains, and there's a problem of the brain drain. It has been obviously been till now also it is there. But why do you think that? Don't you think this is a paradox, that even though we don't have the kind of environment, but still we are able to produce some of the best brains which are doing brain drain? So what is your view on that?
I mean, like that might make a separate panel of its own. But so my views on brain drain. I mean, to be very self-critical about my own country will be like, do we have a national character? Because we have, since independence, we have paid a lot of focus on that we are diverse, and then there's a unity in diversity. But I think the idea should be diversity in unity, because the moment we do that, then our people who are going out for education, myself included, are motivated to come back. I mean, there has to be some. I mean, I am a case in example that I studied in US for 4 years. I'm still affiliated with an American university for 1 year, and I'm coming here and like having a chat with it. And if we see again to the history, that every great power has sold this idea of national character to their masses, that like I mean, the city on a hill, the American dream, century of humiliation. Even Russians have this like Mother Russia, third Constantinople. So there are these national myths. Now we have to ask our national myth. But when we start asking our national myth, then we go into this, we open this Pandora's box of the debates of the caste and religion and all those angles. So that is one approach, one thought. I don't have a concrete answer. I just have thought processes of how to look into this. The second can be a process that, unlike China, where the state determines the society, ours is the ulta. The society determines how the state is gonna look like. Like 5 years back, DMK was sitting in the sitting in the power with 160 seats. Today they are down to 50, and who knows, in the next election they'll be wiped out in 10 years. I mean, political parties do not get formed and wiped out at such a rapid scale, and even those innovations have been adopted well in India that directly affect the society, UPI as a case. So perhaps we need, I don't know what's the answer, but like the society has to come up with a norm that brain drain is something which is bad, or like brain drain which is something which needs to be tackled. And I think that is the way to go around.
I have an associated question with this. You have talked about politics and everything, elections, whether there is continuity of the regime or kind of consistency in the government. So with this kind of obsession with the electoral politics, consistently, election after election, election after election, do you think that government at the critical level, they have that strategic consistency to deal with the issues you are talking about just now, that supply chain, everything, innovation, etc., going for cluster approach, or, that requires a very long-term consistency. So if you evaluate post-independent India, what is your reaction?
So I think we've had, at least at the center, we have had, if we look the 80 years of 75 to 80 years after 1947, 80 years, we have had fair bit of electoral consistency. We were having elections after elections at the state level, but this, on the center level, barring the period of 1990s, the governments were fairly same. So I think, I mean, that's pretty much what I have to say. And then there's also one thing that perhaps there has to be a bipartisan understanding of what national interest is, which is true in a democracy. That, for example, if there's a change of government at the center, or a change of leadership at the center, then the new government or leadership should have certain minimal agreement with what the policies of the last government will be.
You're talking about should have.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. What is your analysis about the character and attribute of, you talked about
Yeah.
the national character.
Yeah.
Why is not happening in India?
Sir, if Mr. Rizvi can answer this question, I think so he knows.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not a, yeah, I'm not a psychologist.
Yeah, very quick. Very quick comments on both. Very interesting, thought-provoking questions. So I think on brain drain, I think I look at it. I mean, slightly in a very simple manner. I think majority of the brain drain as such, which is what is brain drain? Essentially, the movement or the migration of very skilled, a talented sort of working population has primarily happened because of economic opportunity, I think, and better living lifestyle and living conditions. I don't think it has happened in any significant manner for any other reason, right? It's not because of any cultural, political, or any other reasons. It's primarily because people want to find better economic opportunity and better living standards. I think to a large extent, if we fix that, we fix this problem to a large extent. Of course, there's always an element of personal choice, but the thrust that that brain drain is sort of underpinned by is definitely lack of, or perceived lack of sometimes, certain kinds of economic opportunities. That has changed. If we look at, I mean, I think both of us, we're alumni of IITs, and you look at the, where people have been, being placed after graduating from an IIT, right? You look at the companies, you look at the geographic locations, it is changing. It is, of course, even the ones who are going abroad are not going to the same place, they're going to different places. A lot of them have, shuttle between India and the US, for example, right? So there's a lot of revolving door within countries as well. So that churn is happening. Look at the number of unicorns. We've gone from a handful to 100 plus in just a decade. So those economic opportunities are being created. I think in many ways the economic opportunities that part of the puzzle will be solved. What personally I'm more concerned about is the living standards. I think there we'll have to step up the game and particularly have better reforms, of urban governance, of day-to-day, public service delivery. I think that in many ways is sort of, where we have to work towards. And that also connects to what Sir had asked about, what does it take? Like, is the political system in India sort of an obstacle, political culture? System is okay. Yeah, so I think culture obviously, I think, shifts slowly, because the system, like you rightly said, is a system that is shared by other countries as well, right? We have number of democracies who've done very well, who also have pressures of electoral politics. Yes.
The similar kind of system in US.
Yes.
If you take, their defense policy or foreign policy, that has been very consistent, even
Yes.
though the regimes have changed.
It's
But
very.
in India, probably we don't find so.
So we'll do our next panel on that, sir. We'll discuss foreign policy. We'll discuss Gaza. We'll discuss Iran, and about
On,
and we'll
just
the first word will be culture colon Gaza and all that.
I
So yeah, quick one
just
last
one
sentence.
sentence.
We are at 7:30 now. We are supposed to
No,
wind
just
down.
one sentence, and
One sentence.
yeah.
One sentence.
I think the political culture is linked to the overall societal culture and the need for a culture of excellence. I think if we
Yes.
fix that, a lot of institutional structures will get fixed,
I
in
spent
my.
36 years trying to fix it. Yeah.
One more quick thing. There is a tendency sometimes to overestimate the Chinese political culture's consistency. They've not had a peaceful transition of power until Xi Jinping. Almost every other time there were cliques, attempted coups, so on and so forth. And the
Sir,
fact,
next panel.
and, and even Deng Xiaoping, he came through a clique, he had to fight the four widows, I believe,
Yeah,
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 the
we'll
gang of
get
four he had to fight.
one
And
sentence, one sentence.
so
Before I end
ultimately, I
now.
think we have to dig a little deeper. And even in China's case, the outside capital from Chinese people who were there, as well as the Chinese people themselves, they started coming back when the economic prospects in China started improving. First in the 80s, and then after 2005 when they entered the WTO.
So
So we are at the same similar
thank you,
trajectory.
thank you, thank you.
Sir, my 2 seconds.
No, sir, please, 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 sir. No, 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 no. So we are now finishing because I'm getting very dirty looks from Manika and I'm getting notes from this side. I don't know who's writing them, but I'd like to end on one note that somewhere down the road, I got the impression that we were all very frustrated that ye nahi ho raha hai, wo nahi ho raha hai. But having worked 36 years in government, and Mr. Haldar is sitting here, Mr. Manoj Lal is sitting here, there may be other government officers. We've all done 36 into as many people we are. So the amount of things that have come about in India, despite us being a very noisy democracy with all kinds of issues, we are the only plural country left in the world. The other two were USSR and Yugoslavia. We are the only one with 15 languages on the currency note. We are the only one with 32 states and union territories. We are the only one with so many religions. I think there are 7 religions that exist in India. Some people comment that that is why we work so well, because we have 7 gods to look up to. So there's a lot of things. Look at our space program. Look at our nuclear program. Look at the very fact that we have a massive power mix of 500 gigawatts, despite we are not like taking energy from Russia, taking energy from China. We have a problem with oil and gas, yes, but still we are. That's something we have to really work on. And there are hundreds of other things. We've got our own automobile industry. You go to buy a car, you're so confused. Kaun si gaadi kharidne? So there are a lot of things that the country has done. And one last example I'll give you is that point that I had made about defense white papers 25 years ago. 25 years ago, this country had a very bad super cyclone in Odisha, 1999. 10,000 people, I think, on record died. And it was one of the craziest cyclones that really damaged life and property. So, in 25 years today, we give 7 days of early warning on a cyclone. So somewhere down the road, we also did a defense white paper on the national cyclone risk mitigation. So we succeeded. Then there are many other things where things have already been done over the years, and slowly, 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 we are improving. But because we are an open democracy, we keep shouting and screaming at each other. That's why we're very happy to crib against each other, and it is most welcome. And at the end of the day, this is how we move forward. So that is our culture, noisy democracy. Yet we keep moving forward with our noisy democracy. So I'm thanking you for extremely good inputs on Karl Marx. Took me back to my college days. To you, Professor Kamal, for extremely good views that you provided to us. For Deekhit for writing this lovely book, which I'm sure I will get to read now. And I think this copy is meant for me. So, and to all the audience who stayed till 7:30, thank you for your patience. And the next panel, we know what that's going to be. Mr. Manoj Lal will be our next moderator. Thank you.